On Prospect Hill in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, sits a mansion that looks like an escape. 48 acres of manicured gardens, 44 rooms filled with Gilded age collections, 12 separate garden spaces designed over 3 decades. The famous Blue Steps, concrete and birch trees cascading down a hillside, photographed by thousands of visitors each year. Naumkeag appears on postcards as an example of American beauty. Tourists walk the grounds and admire what wealth built. The gardens hide a darker story. One woman spent 70 summers at Naumkeag. She never married. She watched 3 of her 4 siblings die or break. She inherited the estate at 59 and spent the next 29 years expanding its gardens while withdrawing from the world. Each new garden room, the afternoon garden, the Chinese garden, the rose garden, added another layer of beauty around her. The blue steps that visitors photograph were built so she could walk alone to cut flowers. The fortress her father constructed as a summer retreat became her permanent cage. This is not a story about Gilded Age triumph. This is about how family tragedy and immense wealth combined to trap an heiress inside expanding walls of beauty. How a landscape architect and a reclusive collector spent 30 years building paradise while neither could have conventional lives. How the most famous residential garden in America was designed as withdrawal from the world. The building stands at 5 Prospect Hill Road in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The gardens remain open to visitors who want to walk through beauty built from grief. The Trustees of Reservations operate it as a museum. 70,000 people visit annually. But first, the story of how it began. The fortress didn't start as a fortress. In 1884, it was supposed to be a summer escape. Before we begin, a quick question. Where are you watching this from? Are you in the Berkshires planning a visit to Naumkeag or watching from halfway around the world? Drop a comment and let us know. And if you enjoy stories about historic estates and the complicated people who built them, make sure to subscribe. We have more coming. Now, the story of how a summer escape became a 70-year fortress. Chapter 1. Wilderness Summer Colony. In the 1870s, Stockbridge was discovering it could sell wilderness to millionaires. The town sat in the Berkshire Hills of western Massachusetts, roughly 130 miles from New York City. A 3-hour train ride delivered wealthy families to pastoral beauty without the ocean crowds of Newport. The hills rolled in shades of green through summer. The valleys held farms and forests. Monument Mountain rose to the east. The Housatonic River carved through lowlands to the south. Winter came hard. But summer was temperate. No malaria, no urban heat. Fresh air that doctors recommended for recovery from overwork. The transformation began after the Civil War. New fortunes emerged from railroads, manufacturing, finance. The newly rich needed places to establish themselves as cultured rather than merely wealthy. Newport served that purpose on the coast. The Berkshires provided an inland alternative. Simpler, less formal, more intellectual. Writers and artists had discovered the region first. Nathaniel Hawthorne lived in Lenox briefly. Herman Melville farmed nearby. Their presence suggested refinement rather than ostentation. By 1880, 2 distinct summer colonies had emerged. Lenox attracted the more ambitious families. They built larger estates. They competed openly. Society pages tracked their activities. The wealthy went to Lenox to be seen. Stockbridge, 3 miles south, developed differently. Smaller, quieter, less concerned with display. A lawyer from New York would later capture the distinction with typical wit. In Lenox, you are estimated, he said. In Stockbridge, you are esteemed. The difference mattered to families choosing where to build. Prospect Hill rose on Stockbridge's northern edge. The elevation provided views across the Housatonic Valley toward Monument Mountain and the southern Berkshires. The hillside was steep in places, rocky, challenging to build on. Those same qualities, isolation, elevation, natural barriers, appealed to families who wanted separation from town while remaining near it. The location offered both prospect and refuge. Colonial settlement of the area had begun in the 1730s when Stockbridge was founded as a mission community for Native Americans. The Mohican people called various New England locations by names that English settlers adopted or ignored. The mission itself became historic. Reverend John Sargent's house, built around 1740, still stood on Main Street. By the 1880s, the colonial history added cultural weight to what might otherwise be simple countryside. David Dudley Field probably acquired the Prospect Hill property in the 1870s. Field was himself a prominent New York lawyer. He understood the Berkshires' appeal to legal professionals who spent their working years in Manhattan courtrooms. The land sat undeveloped. Field apparently used it for personal recreation rather than construction. The site waited for someone with both money and motivation to build something permanent there. Real estate values in the Berkshires reflected the region's secondary status compared to established wealthy enclaves. Land sold for fractions of what Fifth Avenue or Newport properties commanded. The discount compensated for distance from New York social life in the short season. Most families came only from June through September, perhaps extending into October. The rest of the year, the Berkshires belonged to year-round residents who farmed or provided services to summer people. But the economics worked for the right buyer. Less expensive land meant larger plots. More space meant greater privacy. The ability to create an estate rather than simply occupy a townhouse appealed to men who had made fortunes and wanted visible evidence of their success. A 40-acre property in the Berkshires cost less than a narrow lot in Manhattan. The calculation favored those willing to maintain 2 residences. Infrastructure remained primitive by urban standards. The railroad reached Stockbridge, but roads were rough. Gas lines and water systems existed in town centers, but not on hillsides. Building on Prospect Hill meant bringing in utilities or generating them on site. The challenges limited who could realistically develop such properties. Only families with substantial capital and patience for construction difficulties would attempt it. By 1884, Stockbridge had evolved from frontier mission town to respectable summer colony. Lawyers, doctors, ministers, and businessmen from New York and Boston maintained homes there. The community hosted concerts, lectures, theatrical performances. Local merchants catered to seasonal residents. The infrastructure, hotels, churches, shops could support wealthy families for 4 or 5 months annually. The town had proven itself viable as a retreat. Prospect Hills still waited. The views were spectacular. The elevation protected against valley fog and insects. The steep south-facing slope captured sunlight. The rocky soil that made farming difficult made foundations solid. A skilled architect could work with the topography rather than against it. Terraces could be carved. Gardens could be built on multiple levels. A house, positioned correctly, would command the entire valley. The site needed someone willing to invest heavily in an uncertain venture. Stockbridge was respectable, but not fashionable. Building there meant accepting social limitations. No one would confuse a Stockbridge summer cottage with the great Newport mansions or the Fifth Avenue palaces. The trade was conscious. Privacy and natural beauty instead of social prominence. Esteem instead of estimation. In 1884, that someone arrived. He had just won the biggest legal battle in New York. He was 52 years old and wealthy enough to build whatever he wanted wherever he chose. His family had vacationed in Stockbridge for years. They had picnicked on David Dudley Field's hillside property, admiring the views. When Field agreed to sell, the price was approximately $36,000 for 40 acres. By Manhattan standards, it was remarkably reasonable. The buyer was Joseph Hodges Choate. Chapter 2. The lawyer who built an empire. Joseph Hodges Choate was born in Salem, Massachusetts, on January 24, 1832, the fifth of 6 children in a family that traced its American roots to 1643. John Choate had emigrated from Colchester, England, settling in what became Ipswich, Massachusetts. His descendants included farmers, sea captains, and eventually professionals. By the time Joseph was born, the Choates had established themselves as respectable New England stock without extraordinary wealth. His father, Dr. George Choate, graduated from Harvard University and Harvard Medical School. He practiced medicine in Salem and earned enough to provide his children with good educations. Joseph's mother, Margaret Manning Hodges, came from similar New England lineage. Her ancestor Philip English and his wife had been accused of witchcraft during the Salem trials of 1692. They escaped hanging only by fleeing to New York until sanity returned to Massachusetts. The family history contained both respectability and drama. Joseph's cousin Rufus Choate was already a prominent congressman and senator when Joseph was a boy. The connection mattered. Law and public service ran in the family. Success was expected but not guaranteed. Joseph would have to build his own reputation. He did well at Harvard College, graduating in 1852. He ranked fourth in his class and delivered the Latin oration at commencement. His older brother William graduated as valedictorian the same year. The brothers were competitive and accomplished. Joseph continued to Harvard Law School, completing the degree in 1854. He was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1855, then to the New York bar in 1856. At 24, he moved to New York City. The timing was fortunate. New York was becoming America's legal capital. Large corporations needed sophisticated legal representation. Railroad mergers, trust formations, will contests, and patent disputes generated enormous fees for successful lawyers. Before the Civil War, most attorneys had trained as apprentices in established offices. Joseph represented a new generation, formally educated at elite institutions, comfortable with complex legal theory, capable of arguing cases before the Supreme Court. He joined the office of Scudder and Carter immediately after passing the bar. His success was rapid. By 1860, at age 28, he became junior partner in the firm of Evarts, Southmaid, and Choate. The senior partner, William Maxwell Evarts, would later serve as United States Senator, Secretary of State, and Attorney General. Working under Evarts provided Joseph with connections, experience, and credibility. The firm handled major cases for major clients. Joseph learned how fortunes were made in New York legal practice. He also managed to fall in love with someone unlikely. Carolyn Dutcher Sterling had come to New York from Connecticut in modest circumstances to study art. She wore a wedding ring engraved with, quote, 0, and intended to pursue painting professionally for life. Joseph pursued her persistently. On July 4, 1861, she accepted his proposal. He later wrote that the beleaguered fortress yielded, and he celebrated the anniversary of national independence by sacrificing his own independence for life. Their marriage lasted 55 years until his death. Caroline proved to be not simply an artist, but an activist for women's education. The couple had 5 children. Rudolph Sterling Choate was born in September 1864. George Choate followed, then Josephine. Then Mabel, born December 26, 1870. Finally, Joseph Hodges Choate, Jr., born February 1876. The family established residences in New York appropriate to Joseph's rising income and status. They began vacationing in Stockbridge in the 1870s, joining other legal families who summered in the Berkshires. Joseph's reputation grew through the 1860s and 70s. He specialized in courtroom work rather than office practice. He was an exceptional cross-examiner. His wit made him popular at dinners and social events. His speeches were published as pamphlets and books. He became known as the premier trial lawyer in New York, perhaps in America. The fees reflected that status. Cases before the Supreme Court, complex will contests, corporate disputes. The work was lucrative and prestigious. In 1871, Joseph was appointed to the Committee of 70, formed to investigate and prosecute the Tweed Ring. William Marcy Tweed, a New York State Senator, controlled Tammany Hall and had systematically looted the city treasury. Joseph helped break the political machine and prosecute the indicted officials. The case made him nationally famous. Defeating boss Tweed established Joseph as someone who could take on powerful interests and win. Other famous cases followed. He successfully challenged a federal income tax in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company in 1895. In his argument, he called the tax communistic in its purposes and tendencies. The Supreme Court agreed. He argued against Chinese exclusion laws, representing Chinese immigrants who challenged the legislation's validity. He lost that case, but earned respect for taking it. He represented clients in railroad cases, patent disputes, and major will contests, including those of Samuel Tilden, Alexander Turney Stewart, and Jane Stanford. His career touched most significant legal issues of the Gilded Age. Joseph served as president of the American Bar Association, the New York State Bar Association, and the New York City Bar Association. He was president of the Century Club, the Harvard Club, and numerous other organizations. He received honorary degrees from American and foreign universities. His success allowed him to be selective about cases. He took some work pro bono, particularly when constitutional principles interested him, but mostly he worked for wealthy clients who paid handsomely. Caroline, meanwhile, pursued her own interests. She helped found the Brearley School in New York in 1884 to prepare young women for college admission. Columbia University had refused to admit women despite a petition Joseph helped present in 1883. Caroline responded by creating educational infrastructure. She then helped found Barnard College in 1889 as the women's college affiliated with Columbia. She served as a trustee for years. Their daughters Josephine and Mabel were among Brearley's first students. Caroline believed in women's education not as theory, but as urgent practical necessity. Joseph's personality shaped his success. He was witty without being cruel, confident without arrogance. He told a reporter he always took a corner seat or one next to a window on the elevated railway so as not to be bored on more than one side at once. When asked about the difference between Lenox and Stockbridge, he produced the memorable formulation about estimation versus esteem. His humor deflected while revealing intelligence. People enjoyed his company. That helped in courtroom work and social advancement. By 1884, at age 52, Joseph had achieved financial security and professional prominence. He earned substantial fees annually. He owned property in New York. He could afford to invest in a summer estate. His family had vacationed in Stockbridge for years and loved the area. They had picnicked on David Dudley Field's Prospect Hill property, admiring the views of the Housatonic Valley and the mountains beyond. When Joseph decided to build a summer residence, Stockbridge was the natural choice. Field had opposed Joseph in the Boss Tweed cases years earlier, but Field was willing to sell. Joseph persuaded him to part with 40 acres on the south side of Prospect Hill. The negotiation was professional. The price was approximately $36,000. For a prominent New York lawyer, that was reasonable. The land alone cost less than many Manhattan townhouses. Joseph intended to build something substantial, but not ostentatious. He wanted a family retreat, not a showplace. He hired an architect to design it. Joseph was longtime friends with Charles Follen McKim, one of New York's leading architects. But most of the design work would be done by McKim's young partner, Stanford White. White was 32 years old. The firm of McKim, Mead and White was only 6 years old, but gaining recognition. Joseph trusted McKim's judgment. The commission went to the partnership with White handling most details. Design work began shortly after the 1884 purchase. Joseph envisioned a summer house large enough for his family and guests, comfortable enough for months of occupancy, distinguished enough to reflect his status without ostentation. Stockbridge meant esteem, not estimation. The house should embody that principle. Then in April 1884, his eldest son Rudolph came home from Harvard for spring break. Chapter 3. Death delays construction. Wolof Sterling Choate died on April 5, 1884. He was 19 years old and in his freshman year at Harvard. The cause was a brain aneurysm. He collapsed suddenly and died within hours. There was no warning and no possibility of treatment. Joseph and Caroline lost their eldest son without time to prepare or say goodbye. The family went into mourning. Victorian conventions demanded a period of withdrawal from social activity. Building a summer mansion seemed inappropriate. Stanford White had already begun design work, but Joseph suspended the project. The land on Prospect Hill remained empty. The plans went into a drawer. The family grieved. White understood. He was young enough that he had not yet experienced such losses personally, but he knew grief delayed everything. His firm had other commissions. The Choate project could wait until the family was ready. He continued to refine the drawings, but took no further action. Construction would not begin in 1884. By early 1885, Joseph decided to proceed. Grief did not end, but life continued. His other children needed attention. Caroline needed purpose. Building the house Roelof would never visit seemed both painful and necessary. The family would summer in Stockbridge, and remember, the house would be completed. White's design reflected current architectural fashion. The 1880s favored what would later be called the shingle style, large wooden houses clad in unpainted shingles that weathered to gray, with irregular roof lines, wide porches, and an informal relation to the landscape. The style rejected the Victorian formality of earlier decades. Houses sprawled rather than rising in rigid blocks. Porches wrapped around corners. Windows appeared where views demanded them, rather than where symmetry required them. The effect was comfortable rather than imposing. White designed a house of 44 rooms on 3 main floors, plus attic and basement spaces. The footprint was substantial but not enormous by Gilded Age standards. The Vanderbilt cottages in Newport exceeded 100 rooms. Lennox estates often surpassed 70. Naumkeag would be large enough for family, guests, and staff without being ostentatious. Stockbridge meant esteem, not display. The first floor contained public rooms, entrance hall, library, drawing room, dining room, and service spaces. The second floor held family bedrooms. The third floor provided guest rooms and additional bedrooms. Servants' quarters occupied attic spaces and basement areas. The house had 3 bathrooms initially, which was generous for 1885. Most homes of the period had 1 or none. Indoor plumbing was still relatively new in rural areas. The Choates were installing modern conveniences. The exterior would be shingled in the fashionable manner. The roof would be complex, multiple gables, dormers, and intersecting planes that created visual interest without ostentation. Wide porches on the south and west sides would capture views of the Housatonic Valley and Monument Mountain. The effect would be solid, comfortable, and appropriate to a summer residence for a successful but not showy family. White chose a site near the top of Prospect Hill with southern and western exposures. The house would command views without being visible from the road. Privacy mattered. The steep hillside meant the north side would be partially cut into the slope while the south side stood several stories above grade. The basement level on the north became the main floor on the south. The topography created natural separation between service areas and living spaces. Construction began in spring 1885. The work required substantial site preparation. Workers cut into the hillside to create level building platforms. They excavated for foundations on unstable rocky soil. Prospect Hill was not ideal building terrain. The steep slopes and rock outcroppings made every phase more difficult and expensive than comparable work on flat land would have been. Joseph accepted the cost. The views justified the difficulty. Local contractors handled most of the work. Stockbridge had experienced builders familiar with the area's conditions. Materials came by railroad to Stockbridge Station, then by wagon up the hill. Lumber arrived from local mills. Shingles were manufactured specifically for the project. Stone for foundations came from quarries within 20 miles. Windows and hardware came from suppliers in New York and Boston. The scale was substantial but not unprecedented for the region. The workforce varied by season and phase. Foundation work required fewer men than framing. Finish work required skilled craftsmen rather than general laborers. At peak periods, perhaps 30 to 40 men worked on site. They came from Stockbridge and surrounding towns. Some boarded locally, others commuted daily. The work provided steady employment for more than a year. White visited periodically to review progress and resolve design questions. The firm of McKim, Mead and White maintained an office in New York and could not supervise construction directly. White relied on the contractor to follow drawings and specifications. When problems arose, he traveled to Stockbridge. Most decisions were made by correspondence. The system worked adequately. White trusted competent contractors to execute his designs without constant oversight. Joseph named the house Naumkeag, the Mohican word for the area that became Salem, Massachusetts. The name connected the new summer house to Joseph's birthplace. It also suggested respect for the region's indigenous history. Prospect Hill had been part of the Stockbridge Mohican community in the 18th century. The Reverend John Sargent's house stood nearby. Joseph knew the history. The name Naumkeag acknowledged it while claiming the hillside for his family. Caroline worked with landscape gardener Nathan Barrett on the grounds. Barrett practiced in Massachusetts and had designed landscapes for other Berkshire estates. His approach emphasized natural effects rather than formal geometry. He planned carriage drives, service roads, walking paths, and planting beds that would mature over years. The work was conventional for the period: lawns, specimen trees, foundation plantings, and borders. The landscape would complement the house without competing for attention. The total construction cost was approximately $35,000. For 44 rooms on a difficult hillside site, that was reasonable but not cheap. The cost exceeded the land purchase price. It represented a substantial investment in a house that would be occupied perhaps 6 months per year. Joseph could afford it. His legal practice generated sufficient income that $35,000 was significant but not burdensome. He was building for his family's use and his own satisfaction, not for investment return. The house was completed in fall 1886. The exterior was finished. The interior was plastered, painted, and furnished. The plumbing functioned. The house had gas lighting, which was modern for rural Massachusetts. Heating came from fireplaces and stoves, supplemented by a furnace in the basement. The technology was not cutting edge, but adequate for a summer residence. Joseph and Caroline moved furniture from New York and purchased additional pieces locally. The house became habitable. Naumkeag stood complete on Prospect Hill 2.5 years after Rulof's death. The family would summer there for decades. The views west over the Housatonic Valley were spectacular. The views north toward Monument Mountain were equally fine. The house was comfortable, well-built, and appropriately dignified. It was not grand. It was not intended to be. Stanford White's design would prove durable. The house still stands nearly 140 years later. The shingle style fell from fashion within a decade, but the architecture aged well. The house looked settled rather than dated. That was White's talent. He designed buildings that belonged to their sites as though they had always been there. Joseph had built his summer estate. The family had a retreat from New York's heat and noise. The price had been high in ways that had nothing to do with construction costs. Rulof would never walk through the completed rooms. That loss shaped everything that followed. Chapter 4: Summer Estate, Winter Grief. The house worked. Naumkeag functioned as Joseph intended, a comfortable summer residence large enough for family and guests, removed from New York's heat and social demands, situated for privacy and views. The Choates occupied it from late April through October or November in most years. That was longer than typical Berkshire patterns. Many families came only for 6 weeks in July and August. Joseph kept his family there for 6 months or more. Stockbridge became more than a vacation destination. It became a second home. The household required staff. Robert Creighton served as superintendent, managing the property year-round. Groundskeepers maintained the landscape Nathan Barrett had designed. The estate included farmland that produced vegetables, fruit, and flowers for the house. Dairy cows provided milk and cream. The operation was largely self-sufficient during summer months. Domestic servants handled cooking, cleaning, and service. The exact number varied by season and need, but probably 8 to 12 people worked at Naumkeag during the summer. Joseph commuted to New York when necessary for important cases or court appearances. The railroad made this possible, though not convenient. Stockbridge to New York required 3 hours by train, plus carriage or cab travel on both ends. Joseph could leave Stockbridge in the morning, conduct business in Manhattan, and return by evening if required. More often he stayed in New York for several days, then returned to the Berkshires. Caroline managed the household during his absences. The arrangement allowed Joseph to maintain his practice while enjoying Stockbridge's advantages. Guests visited frequently. Joseph's position meant he entertained professional colleagues, political figures, and social connections. The 44 rooms provided adequate space. Bedrooms on the second floor housed family. Third-floor rooms accommodated visitors. The dining room could seat 12 or more comfortably. Dinner parties, afternoon teas, and informal gatherings filled the summer calendar. The house served its purpose as both retreat and venue for cultivated social life. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was unusual. George Choate began his freshman year at Williams College in the fall of 1886. Williams was located in Williamstown, Massachusetts, in the northwestern corner of the state. The campus was approximately 20 miles from Stockbridge. George lived in a dormitory and attended classes normally. Then in late winter or early spring of 1887, something broke. The exact nature of George's breakdown is not documented in detail. Medical privacy and family discretion prevented public knowledge. The symptoms were severe enough that George could not continue his studies. He withdrew from Williams and never returned. The family brought him home to Stockbridge, hoping the familiar surroundings might help. Joseph and Caroline spent the winter of 1887 at Naumkeag trying to stabilize their son. The house, usually vacant November through March, became a hospital of sorts. George did not recover. Whatever had fractured in his mind remained fractured. By age 20 or so, he was institutionalized at Channing Sanitarium, which specialized in the humane treatment of mental illness. He would spend the rest of his life there. He never married. He never lived independently. He simply disappeared from the family's public life. Joseph and Caroline visited him. They paid for his care. They hoped. But George was gone in all the ways that mattered. They had lost a second son to something they could not prevent or understand. The family continued. Joseph's practice demanded attention. Caroline's work with women's education continued. Josephine and Mabel needed their parents. Joseph Jr., the youngest, was still a boy. Grief did not permit paralysis. The Choates returned to Naumkeag for the summer of 1887 and the summers that followed. The house stood. The views remained spectacular. Life proceeded with one fewer place set at dinner. Estate operations expanded gradually through the early 1890s. Joseph added to the library, which became his preferred room at Naumkeag. He collected books and enjoyed spending evenings reading while the rest of the family pursued other activities. The library received additional shelving and comfortable furniture. It became Joseph's domain within the larger household. The estate hosted political figures occasionally. Joseph's prominence meant he received requests to entertain important visitors to the Berkshires. On October 9, 1897, President William McKinley visited Naumkeag during a tour of western Massachusetts. McKinley signed the guest book. The visit lasted only a few hours, but represented recognition of Joseph's status. Not every summer house received presidential calls. McKinley chose to visit Joseph Choate in Stockbridge. That meant something in the social and political calculus of the Gilded Age. Joseph's career reached its peak in the 1890s. He argued major cases before the Supreme Court. His challenge to the federal income tax succeeded in 1895 in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company. He earned substantial fees for work in railroad cases, will contests, and corporate disputes. His reputation as America's premier courtroom lawyer was secure. The financial rewards allowed him to maintain establishments in New York and Stockbridge without strain. Success justified the investment in Naumkeag. Then in July 1896, Josephine died at Naumkeag. She was in her early 20s. The cause was colitis, an intestinal inflammation that could not be effectively treated in 1896. She became ill, deteriorated rapidly, and died within days or weeks. The house that was supposed to provide escape from urban dangers became the place where another child died. Joseph and Caroline buried their daughter. 3 of their 5 children were now lost. Rulif to aneurysm, George to madness, Josephine to disease. 2 children remained. Mabel was 26 and unmarried. Joseph Jr. was 20 and beginning his own career. The family structure had contracted drastically. What had been a household of 7 was now effectively 4. With George alive but absent, the 44 rooms at Naumkeag felt different. The estate continued to function. Guests came. Dinners were served. The grounds were maintained. But the house had become a monument to loss as much as a summer retreat. Joseph's personality allowed him to continue. He maintained his wit and charm in public. He argued cases brilliantly. He hosted social events at Naumkeag with apparent ease. Whether he felt easy is unknowable. Victorian men of his class were trained to function regardless of emotion. Joseph functioned. Caroline functioned. Mabel and Joseph Jr. functioned. The family survived. The estate by 1900 included approximately 48 acres. Joseph had acquired additional parcels adjacent to the original 40-acre purchase. The expanded property provided more privacy and control over the surrounding viewshed. No one could build close enough to intrude on Naumkeag's isolation. Joseph was securing the fortress boundaries, even if he did not yet think of it as a fortress. The staff structure solidified. Crichton remained as superintendent. A head gardener managed the grounds with assistants. The house employed a cook, housemaids, and a butler or houseman. During the social season, additional temporary help was hired. The operation was professional and efficient. Naumkeag functioned as a significant estate required substantial management. The 1890s ended with Joseph at age 68, Caroline at approximately 60, Mabel at 30, and Joseph Jr. at 24. They had survived catastrophic losses. The estate provided stability and continuity. Whatever else changed, Naumkeag remained. The house stood solid on its hillside. The views persisted. The seasons cycled. Summer meant Stockbridge. That pattern would continue. Joseph's greatest professional opportunity was approaching. In 1899, President McKinley would offer him appointment as ambassador to the court of St. James's. Joseph would represent the United States in London. The family would relocate to England for years. Naumkeag would wait for them. The house knew how to wait. Chapter 5. The Ambassador's Retreat. McKinley appointed Joseph Hodges Choate as ambassador to the United Kingdom in March of 1899. Joseph was 67 years old and at the height of his reputation. The appointment was prestigious and politically significant. Relations between the United States and Britain were improving after decades of tension. Joseph would represent American interests during a critical period. He accepted immediately. The family relocated to London. Joseph Jr. remained in the United States pursuing his own legal career. Mabel accompanied her parents to England. She was 29, unmarried, accomplished in languages and art, but without clear direction. The ambassadorship gave her a role as her father's social assistant. Caroline's health was declining, which meant Mabel often represented the family at diplomatic events. She was capable and performed the duties adequately, but England proved difficult. Joseph served until 1905, spanning the end of McKinley's administration, Theodore Roosevelt's first term, and into Roosevelt's second. He negotiated disputes over Alaska boundary questions, Caribbean naval bases, and commercial treaties. He developed friendships with British political leaders. He was received at court and entertained extensively. The work suited his talents. He enjoyed London's intellectual society and professional challenges. The posting was considered highly successful. The family returned to Naumkeag each summer. The Atlantic crossing took a week. They typically arrived in late May or June and remained until September, then returned to London. The pattern meant Naumkeag was occupied perhaps 3 to 4 months annually during the ambassadorship years, rather than the usual 6. The staff maintained the house and grounds year-round regardless. Crichton ensured everything was ready when the family arrived each summer. Mabel experienced a severe nervous breakdown in 1900. She was 30 years old. The family was in London when the symptoms became acute. The exact nature of her illness was not publicly documented, but it was serious enough that recovery took months. Victorian terminology describes such episodes as bad nervous breakdowns, without specifying whether the diagnosis was depression, anxiety, exhaustion, or something else. Mabel recovered sufficiently to resume social duties, but something had broken. After 1900, she never married. Whether the breakdown caused her permanent singleness, or whether underlying conditions caused both breakdown and singleness, is unknowable. The result was the same. Joseph's ambassadorship ended in April 1905. He was 73. He had served 6 years and accomplished what McKinley and Roosevelt had asked. He returned to private life and to Naumkeag. The family resumed their pattern of extended summers in Stockbridge. Joseph practiced law only sporadically. He was wealthy enough to be selective. He took cases that interested him and declined others. Mostly, he enjoyed being home. The estate received improvements during the 1900s. The most significant was bathroom expansion. The original 3 bathrooms were insufficient for a house of 44 rooms with regular guests. Indoor plumbing technology had improved, Costs had declined. Joseph added 6 bathrooms between 1905 and 1915, bringing the total to 9. That was generous even for the period. The work required running new water lines, installing sewage connections, and reconfiguring room layouts. The expense was substantial, but the improvement in comfort was worth it. Other modifications were minor: additional bookcases in the library, new furniture in several rooms, upgrading the heating system. The house was fundamentally sound and required only maintenance and modernization. Stanford White's design had proven durable. The shingle style weathered well. The gray shingles looked settled rather than shabby. The house belonged to Prospect Hill as though it had always been there. Joseph continued his professional associations and social activities. He received honorary degrees from universities in America and Britain. He served on corporate boards and charitable committees. He gave occasional speeches. Mostly he spent time at Naumkeag, reading in his library, walking the grounds, and enjoying the views. He had built the house as a summer retreat. In his 70s and 80s, it became more than that. It became the place where he was most content. Caroline's health deteriorated through the 1910s. She suffered from ailments typical of old age: arthritis, fatigue, weakness. She continued to paint and to correspond with friends involved in women's education, but she was less active. Mabel increasingly managed household affairs. The role suited Mabel, who had no other obvious purpose. She ran Naumkeag efficiently and cared for her aging parents. It was the occupation she would maintain for decades. Joseph's health remained relatively good into his 80s. He was mentally sharp and physically active enough to walk the property daily. He maintained correspondence with legal colleagues and political figures. His wit persisted. He remained the man who could produce a memorable quip in any conversation. Age had not diminished his fundamental personality. He died on May 14, 1917. He was 85 years old. He died at home in New York rather than at Naumkeag, as spring had not yet fully arrived and the family had not yet moved to Stockbridge for the summer. The cause was old age rather than any specific disease. He had lived a long, successful, and remarkably accomplished life. He left Caroline, Mabel, Joseph Jr., and George, who remained institutionalized and largely unaware. The funeral was in New York, but Joseph was buried in Stockbridge Cemetery. The burial was unusual. Joseph's body was transported from the cemetery gates to the gravesite on a farm wagon owned by the Naumkeag estate. The wagon was covered with laurel branches cut from the property. It was drawn by horses that worked the Naumkeag farm. The procession deliberately evoked ancient customs, the lord of the manor transported on his own land by his own animals. Joseph had spent 33 summers at Naumkeag. He was now part of the Stockbridge earth permanently. The house on Prospect Hill would continue without him. Caroline inherited the estate. She was approximately 77 years old and in declining health. She had spent 31 summers at Naumkeag. The house was as much hers as Joseph's. She intended to maintain it. Mabel would help. The pattern would continue. What no one anticipated was how completely the house would become Mabel's domain, or how long Mabel would occupy it, or what she would build there. Chapter 6. The Inheritance. Caroline lived as a widow for 12 years. She maintained the estate with Mabel's help and occupied Naumkeag each summer. The routine did not change significantly. Staff continued their work. Guests visited less frequently. The social calendar contracted. Caroline was in her late 70s and not inclined to entertain extensively. She painted when strength allowed. She corresponded with friends and former colleagues from her work in women's education. Mostly, she was simply present. The house continued around her. Mabel managed operations. She had no husband, no children, no competing obligations. Naumkeag became her responsibility and her occupation. She was in her late 40s during Caroline's widowhood and had developed into a woman of particular habits and interests. She traveled extensively, often to Asia. She visited China and India multiple times, collecting ceramics, furniture, and art objects. She had excellent taste and sufficient funds to indulge it. The house accumulated her acquisitions. Chinese export porcelain-filled cabinets. Asian furniture appeared in various rooms. Naumkeag was becoming Mabel's museum as much as Caroline's home. Mabel never married. After her breakdown in 1900, She remained single through her 30s, 40s, and into her 50s. Whether this was by choice, by circumstance, or by some combination, is not recorded. Women of her class and generation often remained unmarried if they had independent means. Mabel had both money and purpose. She did not need a husband for financial security or social position. She managed her parents' estate, traveled, collected, and lived privately. That was sufficient. In the summer of 1926, Mabel attended a meeting of the Lenox Garden Club. She was 55 years old and had spent every summer of her life, except the ambassadorship years, at Naumkeag. She knew the Berkshires thoroughly. She knew the established families and the summer social patterns. The garden club meeting was routine. What happened there was not. Fletcher Steele was the speaker. He was a landscape architect from Rochester, New York, and by 1926, he had become the best-known practitioner of his profession in America. He was 41 years old, unmarried, sophisticated, and opinionated. His lecture that summer day impressed Mabel. She approached him afterward. They discussed gardens. Steele mentioned that he might be available for a consultation. Mabel invited him to visit Naumkeag. Steele came, examined the property, and delivered his assessment. The house was well situated. The views were spectacular. The landscape was conventional and dull. Nathan Barrett's 1880s design had aged into mediocrity. Worse, the service entrance on the north side was what Steele called a quote two delivery wagons. Tradesmen and staff entered through an area that was purely utilitarian, muddy, cluttered, and graceless. Steele insisted that before anything else could be done, the service court needed complete redesign. Mabel agreed. The collaboration began with that practical project. Steele designed a formal service court with brick paving, walls, and architectural elements that transformed a functional space into something deliberate and dignified. The work was completed in 1926 and 1927. It cost several $1,000s. Mabel paid without hesitation. The result justified the expense. The service area was no longer an embarrassment. It was a design space that announced someone cared about every aspect of the property. Not just the parts guests saw. Steele would return every year for the next 3 decades. He became a fixture at Naumkeag, staying in a dedicated bedroom that contained a drawing table where he could work on plans. The relationship between Mabel and Steele was professional, collaborative, and close. They shared aesthetic sensibilities. Both valued design that was sophisticated without being ostentatious. Both believed gardens should evolve through layers of work over years rather than being completed in a single campaign. They understood each other. In 1927, Mabel purchased the Mission House, a historic structure in Stockbridge built in 1742 by Reverend John Sargent for the Mohican mission community. The house was deteriorating and at risk of demolition. Mabel bought it, had it restored, and eventually donated it to preservation organizations. The purchase demonstrated her commitment to Stockbridge's history and her willingness to spend money on preservation rather than simply on her own comfort. She was becoming a philanthropist, though a private one. Carolyn died in 1929. She was approximately 89 years old and had lived at Naumkeag for 43 summers. She left the estate to Mabel. The will was straightforward. Joseph Jr. received other bequests. George remained institutionalized and was provided for through trusts. Mabel inherited Naumkeag complete: house, land, furnishings, collections, staff, and responsibilities. Mabel was 59 years old. Most women of her generation were grandmothers at that age. Mabel had never married and had no children. She had spent her entire life in her parents' households, first in New York and then increasingly at Naumkeag. She had no independent career despite her education and capabilities. She had traveled extensively but always returned. She had managed her parents' estate but always under their ultimate authority. Now, at nearly 60, she owned it outright. The house was hers. The land was hers. The decisions were hers. She began to build. Not new structures initially, but new gardens. Steele had ideas. Mabel had money. They would transform the conventional Barrett landscape into something unprecedented. The service court had been merely preparation. The real work was about to begin. Mabel would spend the next 29 years expanding and elaborating the gardens at Naumkeag. She would pour money into the project in amounts that suggest obsession as much as enthusiasm. Each garden would become another room in an expanding complex of outdoor spaces. The house would remain physically unchanged, but the landscape would multiply around it. Mabel was building something, though it would take years to understand exactly what. Chapter 7. The Landscape Architect. Fletcher Steele believed gardens needed time to become themselves. He called it patina, the accumulated effects of weather, growth, and age that transformed new work into something that looked inevitable. His most famous statement on the subject was characteristically blunt: "Nothing gets right until time gets in its work." That philosophy would shape everything he built at Naumkeag over 3 decades. He was designing for years ahead, not for immediate effect. Mabel understood this instinctively. She had time, she had money, she wanted gardens that would deepen rather than simply deteriorate. Steele was born in Rochester, New York, in 1885. His family was comfortable, but not wealthy. He attended Williams College, graduating in 1907 with interests in literature, art, and design. Williams was in Williamstown, Massachusetts, less than an hour from Stockbridge. Steele knew the Berkshires from his college years. After graduation, he entered Harvard's new Master of Landscape Architecture program, one of the first formal graduate programs in the field. He studied under Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr., whose father had designed Central Park and established landscape architecture as a profession in America. Steele learned classical principles but developed modernist sensibilities. He graduated in 1909 and began practice. By the 1920s, Steele had established himself as America's most prominent landscape architect. He worked for wealthy clients across the Northeast, designing gardens that combined European formality with American informality. His style was distinctive. He used architectural elements boldly, incorporated modernist ideas about space and form, and refused to simply replicate historic precedents. He wrote extensively for professional journals and popular magazines. His lectures drew crowds. When Mabel heard him speak in Lenox in 1926, she was encountering someone at the peak of his profession and confidence. Steele was 41 when he met Mabel. She was 55. Both were unmarried. Both were sophisticated, well-traveled, and aesthetically demanding. Both had money enough to pursue their interests without compromise. The collaboration began professionally with the Service Court redesign in 1926 and 1927. It continued for the rest of Mabel's life. The working relationship developed its own rituals and legends. Steele stayed in a dedicated bedroom at Naumkeag whenever he visited, which was multiple times each summer. The room contained a drawing table where he could develop plans. He was treated as family rather than hired help. The arrangement was unusual but practical. Designing gardens required observing how light moved across the site at different times of day, how water flowed after rain, how plants matured through the season. Steele needed extended time on site. Mabel provided it. The most famous story about their collaboration involved martinis in the afternoon garden. According to legend, Steele and Mabel would sit in the stone chairs he had designed, drinking cocktails while discussing potential projects. When they agreed on a direction, Mabel would summon her checkbook and write a check on the spot. The story captured something true about their dynamic. Decisions were made informally, money flowed freely, alcohol was involved, and Mabel trusted Steele's judgment completely. Whether the specific detail about checkbooks in the garden was literally accurate mattered less than what it represented. Steele celebrated his birthday at Naumkeag annually when possible. Mabel hosted small parties for him, inviting local friends and seasonal residents. The gatherings acknowledged that Naumkeag had become central to Steele's life and work. Of the approximately 700 gardens he designed during his career, Naumkeag received more attention, more investment, and more of his time than almost any other. It was his laboratory and his masterpiece. Mabel made that possible through consistent patronage over 30 years. Speculation about the nature of their relationship was inevitable. An unmarried woman and unmarried man collaborating intimately for decades would generate assumptions. Some contemporaries believed they were romantically involved. The dedicated bedroom, the long visits, the close decision-making. The evident affection suggested more than professional courtesy. But the speculation was almost certainly wrong. Mark Wilson, who became curator of Naumkeag decades later and studied the archives extensively, concluded definitively that there was no sexual relationship between them. Steele was probably homosexual. Mabel had experienced a breakdown in 1900 that left her incapable of, or uninterested in, marriage. They were two people who could not have conventional relationships, finding companionship and purpose together. What they built was a working partnership of unusual depth. Steele respected Mabel's intelligence and taste. Mabel respected Steele's genius and vision. They could disagree without rupture. They could collaborate without ego conflicts. The relationship worked because both participants were emotionally mature, financially secure, and genuinely interested in creating something excellent. Romance would have complicated or destroyed that. Friendship and shared aesthetic purpose sustained it. Steele's design philosophy emphasized several principles that shaped his work at Naumkeag. Gardens should respond to specific sites rather than imposing generic templates. Historical references were acceptable, but should be transformed rather than copied. Modernist ideas about space, form, and materials should inform traditional garden making. Plants mattered, but architecture mattered more. Water should be used boldly. Gardens should create distinct rooms with clear transitions. Most importantly, gardens should improve with age through patina. New work should look crude. Time would refine it into something that appeared to have always been there. He applied these principles at Naumkeag over and over. Each garden he designed responded to a specific portion of the site, solved particular problems, and created distinct experiences. The afternoon garden addressed a relatively flat terrace south of the house. The blue step solved the problem of connecting two levels on a steep slope. The Chinese temple garden incorporated Mabel's Asian collections into the landscape. The evergreen garden created a winter-focused space. Each project was site-specific and theoretically sophisticated while remaining functional and beautiful. Steele continued working at Naumkeag until the mid-1950s. His last major project was installing the moon gate in the Chinese garden in 1955. He was 70 years old. Mabel was 84. They had collaborated for 29 years. The estate had been transformed from a conventional Gilded Age property with standard Victorian landscaping into something unprecedented. A series of distinct garden rooms that demonstrated the evolution of American landscape architecture from historicism through modernism. Of the approximately 700 gardens Steele designed, only 2 still exist in forms recognizable from his plans. One is a private estate. The other is Naumkeag. Every other Steele garden has been demolished, subdivided, altered beyond recognition, or simply abandoned to decay. Naumkeag survived because Mabel bequeathed it intact to a preservation organization with instructions and funding to maintain it. Without that deliberate act, Steele's work would exist primarily in photographs and archives. Naumkeag is the only publicly accessible Steele garden in the world. That was Mabel's gift, though she could not have fully anticipated its significance. Steele died in 1971 at age 85. He outlived Mabel by 13 years. By then, Naumkeag was open to the public, and his reputation was secure. He had transformed American landscape architecture through his designs, writings, and teaching. But his masterpiece remained the hillside in Stockbridge, where he and an unmarried heiress had spent decades building beauty together. Chapter 8. The gardens multiply gardens take money. They also take time, vision, and willingness to wait for trees to mature and paths to weather into something that looks natural rather than imposed. Mabel had all of these. Between 1929, when she inherited Naumkeag, and 1958, when she died, she spent approximately 30 years building gardens with Fletcher Steele. The exact cost is not documented, but considering the scope of work and the period involved, the total was certainly in the millions of dollars. Each garden was a separate project requiring design, excavation, construction, planting, and years of refinement. Some took months, others took decades. All of them cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. The afternoon garden came first among the major projects. Developed through the late 1920s, Steele designed it on a relatively flat terrace south of the house where views extended toward Monument Mountain. The space had been lawn. Steele transformed it into a formal garden room defined by hedges and architectural elements. He installed tall Venetian poles painted bright colors, blue, white, yellow, that stood like abstract sculptures against the green hedges. The poles were purely decorative, serving no function except to create vertical accents and visual surprise. They announced that this would not be a conventional garden. The centerpiece was a pair of stone chairs, positioned to face the mountain views. The chairs were uncomfortable by design. Steele believed outdoor furniture should encourage alertness rather than drowsiness. The stone seats were hard and upright. Sitting in them meant experiencing the garden actively rather than passively. According to legend, Mabel complained about the discomfort. Steele refused to change the design. The chairs remained hard. That was the nature of their collaboration. Mabel paid, but Steele controlled aesthetics. She accepted his judgment even when it meant physical discomfort. The Chinese temple garden evolved over the longest period. From approximately 1917 through 1955, Mabel had begun collecting Asian art and furniture during her travels in the 1910s and 20s. She owned Chinese ceramics, carved wooden screens, stone sculptures, and architectural fragments. Steele helped her integrate these objects into a garden space that honored their origins without simply creating a theme park. The garden occupied a terraced area northwest of the house, with mature trees providing shade and enclosure. The key element was a moon gate, a circular opening in a wall through which visitors passed from one garden room to another. Steele designed and installed the gate in 1955, making it one of his final projects at Naumkeag. He was 70, Mabel was 84. The gate was made of smooth stucco painted pale gray, and its circular opening framed views of the landscape beyond. Walking through the moon gate meant leaving one experience and entering another. It was a threshold, a transition, a moment of passage. Steele understood thresholds. The blue steps remain the most famous element at Naumkeag and the most photographed. Completed in 1938. They solved a practical problem through spectacular design. The hillside dropped steeply between two garden levels. Mabel needed a way to move between them without climbing a conventional staircase. Steele designed a stepped water feature that combined fountain, stairway, and sculpture into something unprecedented in American landscape architecture. The steps descended through 4 flights separated by landings. Water flowed down a channel between white birch trees planted on both sides. The steps themselves were painted navy blue, not bright blue as many assume, but a deep navy that contrasted with the white bark of the birches. The birch trees were the key to the design. Their white trunks and delicate leaves created a column de lis through which water and visitors descended. The trees were replanted every 15 or 20 years, as birches are short-lived. Each generation of trees recreated the effect Steele intended. The Blue Steps celebrated their 75th anniversary in 2013, by which point they had become iconic. Landscape architects studied them. Photographers featured them in books and magazines. Visitors came specifically to see them. Nothing comparable existed anywhere else. The design was revolutionary, modernist in its bold use of color and form, classical in its axial clarity, romantic in its integration of water and trees. Steele had synthesized multiple traditions into something entirely new. The origin was practical. Mabel wanted easier access between garden levels. She was in her 60s by the late 1930s, and climbing stairs was becoming difficult. Steele could have built a conventional staircase with handrails. Instead, he created one of the 20th century's most significant landscape designs. That was his genius, finding opportunities for beauty and functional requirements. The steps worked perfectly for their intended purpose. They also transcended that purpose entirely. The Evergreen Garden appeared in 1948. Steele designed it as a winter-focused space that would provide visual interest when deciduous trees and perennial borders were dormant. He used evergreen shrubs, arborvitae, rhododendrons, yews, hemlocks, in masses and blocks that created architectural forms. The garden was severely formal, almost abstract. It demonstrated Steele's modernist sensibilities most clearly. This was not a garden that referenced historical precedents. It was contemporary design rooted in 20th century ideas about space, form, and material. The rose garden occupied a terraced area visible from Mabel's bedroom. Steele designed serpentine brick paths that curved through beds of roses and perennials. The layout was informal compared to the afternoon garden's geometry, or the evergreen garden's abstraction. The curves invited wandering rather than processional movement. Mabel could look down from her bedroom window and watch the roses bloom through the summer. The garden was private in a way the others were not. It existed primarily for her view and her solitary walks. The linden allée required restoring and expanding an existing tree-lined walk that Nathan Barrett had planted in the 1880s. The original lindens had matured but were declining. Steele replaced them with 71 new linden trees in 2013 during major restoration work, though the design dated to his earlier interventions. The alley created a shaded corridor that ran north-south along the western edge of the property. Walking through it meant passing under a green canopy that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns. The space was cool, quiet, and separate from the more architectural gardens. Water connected many of the gardens through a runnel system Steele designed. Small channels carried water from upper terraces down the hillside, creating movement and sound throughout the property. The water was functional. It drained areas that would otherwise become muddy, but Steele made it decorative. The runnels were lined with stone or brick, carefully graded to control flow velocity, and positioned to catch light. Water became another material in his palette alongside plants, stone, and color. Each garden was a room. Each room had character, purpose, and boundaries. Moving through the sequence meant experiencing different moods and aesthetics. The afternoon garden was formal and colorful. The Chinese garden was contemplative and culturally specific. The blue steps were dramatic and kinetic. The evergreen garden was severe and architectural. The rose garden was intimate and personal. Together they created a complex that took hours to explore thoroughly. Mabel could walk for an entire morning and never leave her own property or repeat a route. The cost was extraordinary. Excavating hillsides, installing water systems, constructing stone walls and steps, planting thousands of trees and shrubs, maintaining everything through years of growth. The expenses accumulated relentlessly. Mabel paid without complaint. She had inherited wealth from Joseph and Caroline. She had no children. She had no expensive habits beyond travel and collecting. The gardens were where her money went. They were her legacy, though she may not have thought of them that way while writing checks. The house remained physically unchanged through all of this. The 44 rooms Stanford White had designed in 1885 stood unaltered except for the bathroom additions and minor modernizations. But the landscape expanded continuously. More gardens meant more spaces to inhabit, more places to walk, more beauty to maintain. Mabel was building something that grew larger around her every year. The fortress was expanding while she remained inside. Chapter 9. The Private Philanthropist. Wealth creates obligations for those who take obligations seriously. Mabel took them seriously. She had inherited a fortune she had not earned through her own work. Her father and grandfather had accumulated it through law, investments, and fortunate timing. She received the benefit simply by being born into the right family. That accident of birth came with responsibilities she recognized even if she never spoke about them publicly. Her philanthropy was quiet and local. She did not establish foundations or endow university buildings with her name attached. She identified needs in Stockbridge and addressed them directly with money. The Mission House restoration in 1927 was her first major project. She purchased the building, hired craftsmen to restore it properly, and eventually donated it to preservation organizations. In 1948, she formalized the gift by deeding the Mission House to the Trustees of Reservations with an endowment of approximately $100,000 to fund maintenance in perpetuity. The bequest was careful and practical. Mabel understood that buildings required ongoing care, not just one-time gifts. She supported the Merrill Tavern Inn when it faced financial difficulties. She contributed to the Austin Riggs Center, a psychiatric treatment facility in Stockbridge. She donated to the Berkshire Museum in Pittsfield. She supported Tanglewood, the summer home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, which had opened in 1937 just outside Lenox. She sold the Stockbridge Casino to a preservation organization for $1 when the building faced demolition. Her giving was substantial and consistent. She wrote checks and expected competent management in return. The pattern was deliberately private. Mabel avoided publicity. She did not attend charity galas or society events. She made donations quietly and expected no recognition beyond simple acknowledgement. This was partly personality. She was shy and preferred solitude, but also philosophy. Publicity about giving suggested the giver wanted credit. Mabel wanted results. The difference mattered to her. Her life by the 1950s had contracted to a predictable routine. She spent summers at Naumkeag from April through November. She wintered in New York or traveled. She corresponded with friends, managed her collections, and worked with Fletcher Steele on garden projects. She walked the property daily when weather permitted. She read extensively. She was comfortable in her own company and required little external stimulation. At 75, 80, 85, she continued patterns established decades earlier. Staff managed the house and grounds. Robert Crichton had died, but his successors maintained the property to high standards. Gardeners worked year-round, keeping the Steele gardens pristine. Domestic staff handled cooking, cleaning, and maintenance. Mabel employed perhaps 6 to 8 people full-time plus seasonal help during summer. The cost was substantial, but necessary. Naumkeag required professional management. Mabel provided it. Her relationship with her brother Joseph Jr. was cordial, but not close. He had his own life and family. He visited Naumkeag occasionally, but did not share Mabel's attachment to the property. George remained institutionalized at Channing Sanitarium, where he had spent nearly 70 years. He was in his 80s and had outlived most people born in his generation. The Choate family had contracted to Joseph Jr., George, and Mabel. No grandchildren existed to inherit Naumkeag. That fact would shape what happened next. Mabel began planning her estate in the early 1950s. She was in her 80s and realistic about mortality. She owned Naumkeag outright: house, land, furnishings, collections. Everything. She had to decide what would happen to it after her death. The obvious option was leaving it to family. Joseph Jr. could inherit. His children could eventually take possession. The property would remain private. Mabel rejected that option. She decided instead to bequeath Naumkeag complete to the Trustees of Reservations, the conservation organization that already managed the mission house. The decision was deliberate and carefully structured. She would leave the entire property, all 48 acres, the house, every piece of furniture, every ceramic in the collections, every garden Fletcher Steele had designed. Nothing would be sold or distributed. Everything would remain intact. The trustees would open Naumkeag to the public as a house museum. The bequest included an endowment of approximately $900,000 to fund operations and maintenance. Mabel understood that opening a historic property to the public required staff, insurance, utilities, repairs, and marketing. She calculated carefully what would be needed and provided it. The endowment was structured to generate income through conservative investments. The trustees could draw approximately 4% annually, which would provide roughly $36,000 per year in operating funds. Combined with admission revenue and membership dues, that should be sufficient. Mabel had done the mathematics. Not everyone approved. Jeffrey Platt, a relative by marriage, objected strenuously to the plan. He believed Naumkeag should remain in the family. He argued that Mabel's obligation was to her relatives, not to strangers who would tour the house after her death. The objection was reasonable from a certain perspective. Many families kept estates private for generations, but Mabel held firm. Her will specified the trustees' bequest clearly. If relatives wanted to contest it, they could do so in court after she died. She did not change her decision. Her reasoning was probably mixed. She had no children and limited attachment to extended family. Joseph Jr. had his own resources and did not need Naumkeag. Keeping the estate private meant it would eventually be sold or subdivided. No single owner could afford the maintenance costs forever. Opening it to the public meant it would survive intact. The gardens Fletcher Steele had spent 30 years designing would be preserved. The house Stanford White had built would be maintained. Her collections would remain together. That mattered more to her than family continuity. There was also the matter of legacy. Mabel had spent 70 summers at Naumkeag. She had invested millions of dollars in the gardens. She had assembled remarkable collections of Asian art and American furniture. She had lived a life of extraordinary privilege and relative isolation. Bequeathing everything to the public was her way of giving back what she had received by accident of birth. It was restitution, redemption, or simply recognition that beauty should be shared rather than hoarded. Whatever her precise motivation, the decision was final. Mabel died on either December 10th or 11th, 1958. The exact date is recorded differently in various sources. She was 87 years old. She died at Naumkeag, having spent her final autumn there as she had spent every autumn since 1886, except during the ambassadorship years. She was buried in Stockbridge Cemetery near her parents and siblings. Her will was probated. The trustees of Reservations accepted the bequest. They had inherited one of the most significant 20th century estates in America. Preparations for opening to the public began immediately. The trustees hired staff, installed safety systems, created visitor routes through the house and gardens, printed brochures, and established admission fees. On a day in 1959, the first visitors who were not Mabel's invited guests walked through Naumkeag's rooms and gardens. They saw her collections. They walked the blue steps. They experienced what she had built over 70 years. The fortress had opened its gates. Chapter 10. The Trustees inherit a masterpiece. The Trustees of Reservations was founded in 1891 by landscape architect Charles Eliot, son of Harvard President Charles William Eliot. The organization was America's first land trust, created specifically to preserve properties of scenic, historic, or ecological significance for public benefit. By 1959, the trustees managed dozens of properties across Massachusetts. Naumkeag was among the most significant they had ever received. A complete Gilded Age estate with intact furnishings, collections, and one of the 20th century's most important landscape architecture projects, it was an extraordinary gift. It was also an extraordinary responsibility. Opening the property required immediate investment. The trustees installed fire suppression systems, security alarms, and liability insurance. They hired a curator, ground staff, and seasonal docents to lead house tours. They created walking routes through the gardens with interpretive signs. They established admission fees, modest initially, perhaps $1 or $2 per adult. They printed brochures and advertised in regional publications. By late spring 1959, Naumkeag was ready for visitors. The response exceeded expectations. Approximately 11,000 people visited in the first full year of operation. They came to see the house Stanford White had designed, the gardens Fletcher Steele had created, and the collections Mabel had assembled. The blue steps alone justified the admission price. Nothing comparable existed elsewhere. Visitors from Boston, New York, and throughout New England added Naumkeag to their Berkshire itineraries alongside Tanglewood and Summer Theater. The financial model Mabel had structured proved functional initially. The endowment generated approximately $36,000 annually through conservative investment returns. Admission revenue provided another third of operating costs. Trustees' membership dues covered the remainder. The system worked because costs were relatively low in 1959. Staff salaries were modest. Utilities were inexpensive. Maintenance could be deferred temporarily without immediate consequences. The gardens required regular work, but not urgent intervention. But maintenance requirements compound. Gardens age, systems deteriorate. What can be deferred for 1 year becomes critical in 5 years and catastrophic in 10. The trustees managed Naumkeag competently through the 1960s and 70s. They maintained the house properly. They kept the gardens presentable. They welcomed visitors and educated them about the property's significance. The operation was stable, if not expansive. Problems emerged gradually through the 1980s and 90s. The endowment grew through reinvested returns, but not fast enough to match rising costs. Inflation eroded purchasing power. Labor costs increased faster than general inflation. Insurance premiums rose. Utilities became expensive. Modern safety and accessibility requirements imposed new costs. The original endowment of $900,000 had grown to perhaps $1.5 million by 2000. But that represented declining real value. The 4% draw rule meant operating funds increased nominally, while actual purchasing power stagnated or declined. The gardens began to show distress. White birch trees in the Blue Steps Alley died and were not promptly replaced. Birches are short-lived, 15 to 20 years in cultivated landscapes, and require regular replacement to maintain Steele's intended effect. Without new plantings, gaps appeared in the columned corridor. The white bark that contrasted so dramatically with the navy steps disappeared. The design's fundamental concept eroded. Arborvitae shrubs in the evergreen garden grew beyond their intended forms. Steele had specified regular shearing to maintain architectural masses. Without consistent pruning, the shrubs became overgrown and lost their sculptural quality. What was supposed to be a demonstration of modernist abstraction through plant material became merely a collection of large evergreen bushes. The design disappeared beneath uncontrolled growth. The linden allée darkened. Trees that should have been limbed up to allow light beneath the canopy were neglected. Lower branches remained. The understory became dense and shadowy. Walking through the allée was no longer pleasant. It felt enclosed and slightly threatening rather than cool and contemplative. Staff and visitors began describing it as, quote, 5.6. That was not patina. That was failure. The rock garden that Steele had designed on a slope near the Blue Steps was gradually buried and forgotten. Leaves accumulated, soil washed downslope, weeds colonized. Within a decade, the rock garden was invisible. No one remembered it existed. Only when later restoration work accidentally uncovered stones did staff realize something had been there. The Blue Steps themselves suffered structural damage. Water infiltration caused spalling. The concrete beneath the navy paint flaked and crumbled. Fountains that had been integral to Steele's design failed and were not repaired. The water system's pumps and pipes corroded. By the 2000s, much of the water Steele had designed to flow through the property sat stagnant or simply stopped flowing. The gardens became drier, quieter, and less dynamic than intended. Mark Wilson, who became curator decades after Mabel's death, would later describe the situation bluntly. You had to explain the garden rather than let it speak for itself. That was the clearest possible indication of failure. Steele had designed gardens that communicated through direct experience. Visitors should understand the design by walking through it, not by having docents explain what should have been there. Wilson estimated that by the early 2000s, half the design was gone. The gardens had aged beyond patina into deterioration. The problem was economic. Fletcher Steele had created gardens that required constant skilled maintenance to survive. Birches needed replacement. Hedges needed shearing. Water systems needed repair. Stone needed repointing. Trees needed pruning. The work was endless and expensive. Mabel had understood this and provided an endowment, but she had underestimated how quickly costs would rise relative to investment returns. Or perhaps she had simply bet that her gift would inspire additional support. That bet took 50 years to pay off. The trustees faced a decision by the early 2000s. They could allow gradual decline to continue until Naumkeag became merely a historic house with overgrown grounds. Or they could attempt a comprehensive restoration that would require millions of dollars they did not have. The choice was between managed decline and aggressive fundraising. The problem was that most donors preferred to fund new projects rather than deferred maintenance. Restoring what once existed was harder to sell than creating something new. Then in fall 2012, someone offered to change the equation. An anonymous donor pledged $1 million on one condition. The trustees had to raise a matching million and complete the entire restoration by summer 2016. 4 years to accomplish work that would normally take a decade. $2 million when $3 million would be more realistic. It was simultaneously generous and impossible. The trustees accepted. They had no alternative. Naumkeag was either going to be saved properly or it was going to continue declining. There was no middle option remaining. Chapter 11. $3 million in 3 years. Fletcher Steele had documented everything. Over 30 years of work at Naumkeag, he had produced plans, sketches, planting lists, correspondence with Mabel, memos to contractors, photographs, and detailed notes about his intentions. The archives held more than 1,000 pages of material. When Mark Wilson and Cindy Brockway began planning the restoration in winter 2012 and 2013, they had unprecedented access to the designer's thinking. Most historic garden restorations require educated guesswork. Naumkeag's restorers could simply read what Steele had written. Wilson was the curator who had watched the garden's decline for years. Brockway was the Trustees' Cultural Resources Director with experience managing complex preservation projects. They assembled the archival material and began making decisions. The anonymous donors challenge meant they had 4 years to complete work that would normally require 10. The timeline was aggressive. The fundraising target was ambitious. The scope was comprehensive. Every garden needed attention simultaneously. They accepted the constraints and started. Fundraising came first. The trustees launched a capital campaign targeting major donors, foundations, and government agencies. The Massachusetts Cultural Council provided grants. The town of Stockbridge contributed through its Community Preservation Act funds. Individual donors responded to direct appeals. The matching requirement created urgency. Every dollar raised unlocked matching funds. By spring 2013, the trustees had secured sufficient commitments to begin Phase 1. Phase 1 focused on the Blue Steps and 5 adjacent gardens. The work had to be completed by July 2013 to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Blue Steps' original construction in 1938. That meant approximately 3 months for excavation, construction, planting, and finishing work that would normally take a full season or more. Wilson and Brockway hired contractors and committed to 14-hour workdays. Then it rained. Spring 2013 was unusually wet. Precipitation fell almost daily for weeks. The hillside became saturated. Excavations filled with water, trenches collapsed. The site turned into what Wilson later described as, quote, 9 workers struggled to move equipment. At one point during a site visit, Wilson stepped into mud deep enough that his boot was completely buried. He later joked that he lost a shoe. The conditions were miserable. The timeline was non-negotiable. Work continued. The Blue Steps required complete reconstruction. The concrete beneath the navy paint had spalled from decades of water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycles. Contractors removed damaged sections, repaired the substrate, and repainted. Research into Steele's original specifications revealed that the color was navy blue, not the bright blue many visitors remembered. Photographs and paint analysis confirmed the darker shade. The restored steps were painted navy. Some visitors complained that the color looked wrong. The color was correct. Memory was unreliable. 48 new white birch trees were planted to replace the alley that had died. Birches were sourced from nurseries that could provide specimens of appropriate size, large enough to create immediate effect, but small enough to transplant successfully. Each tree required careful placement to recreate Steele's intended spacing and alignment. The work was precise and expensive. Birch trees mature quickly, but also die quickly. The new plantings would need replacement again in 15 or 20 years. That was acceptable. Steele had designed for regular renewal, not permanence. During excavation near the Blue Steps, contractors uncovered stones that should not have been there. Investigation revealed the lost rock garden that had been buried under decades of leaf litter and soil accumulation. No one remembered it existed. The archives confirmed Steele had designed it. Photographs showed what it had looked like in the 1940s. The discovery was fortunate. Restoration work proceeded to uncover and rebuild the feature. What had been completely forgotten was recovered. The afternoon garden required hedge replacement and restoration of the Venetian poles. The Chinese garden needed path repair and water system restoration. The rose garden required new plantings and infrastructure work. The evergreen garden demanded severe pruning to restore the architectural masses Steele had intended. All of this happened simultaneously while rain continued and mud persisted. The crews worked through conditions that would have justified stopping. The deadline did not permit delay. 200 trees were removed from overgrown areas. 250 new trees were planted, including the birches, various ornamental species, and 71 new linden trees for the linden alley. The lindens were substantial specimens that required mechanical equipment to plant. Each tree cost hundreds of dollars. 71 trees represented a significant line item in the budget. The alley had been dark and forbidding. The new plantings restored Steele's intention, a shaded corridor that was cool rather than oppressive. The water system throughout the property required complete overhaul. Steele had designed runnels, fountains, and pools that depended on reliable plumbing and pumps. Decades of deferred maintenance meant much of the system had failed. Contractors excavated, replaced pipes, installed new pumps, and tested water flow. When the work was finished, water moved through the gardens again as Steele had intended. The sound and movement animated spaces that had been static for years. Phase 1 was completed in July 2013 on schedule for the 75th anniversary celebration. The work had taken approximately 3 months of intensive effort. The results were dramatic. The Blue Steps looked as they had in 1938. The gardens surrounding them functioned again as design spaces rather than neglected remnants. Visitors could experience what Steele and Mabel had created rather than hearing descriptions of what used to be there. Phases 2 through 4 continued through 2014 and 2015. Work included additional garden restoration, infrastructure improvements, and ongoing planting programs. Each phase built on previous accomplishments. The gardens became progressively more complete. By 2016, most of Steele's design was recovered and functional. Phase 5 addressed the greenhouses and farm areas. This work was particularly expensive, approximately $1.5 million for structures that were utilitarian rather than decorative. But the farm had been integral to Naumkeag's operations during the Choate years. Vegetables, fruits, and flowers had been produced on site. The greenhouses had propagated plants for the gardens. Restoring agricultural capacity was historically accurate and operationally useful. The trustees could grow their own plant material rather than purchasing everything from outside nurseries. Additional funding came from government sources. In 2023, the Massachusetts legislature appropriated $38,000 specifically for detail work on the Blue Steps. The ongoing maintenance requirements never ended. The restoration had recovered what was lost, but keeping it required vigilant care and regular investment. The original endowment Mabel had provided in 1958 was insufficient. The trustees had learned that lesson expensively. Total restoration costs reached $4.5 million by completion. The original estimate had been $3 million. Cost overruns are normal in complex preservation projects. The trustees absorbed the difference through additional fundraising and budget adjustments. The alternative, abandoning the project midstream, was unacceptable. They had committed to completing the work by summer 2016. They met the deadline. The results justified the investment. Visitation increased from approximately 11,000 annually in the early years to more than 70,000 by 2025. The Blue Steps became an iconic image featured in garden publications worldwide. Landscape architecture students studied Naumkeag. Photographers sought permission to shoot the property. The trustees had saved America's only publicly accessible Fletcher steel garden. That achievement had required millions of dollars and years of exhausting work, but Steele's masterpiece and Mabel's fortress survived intact. Chapter 12. The Fortress Opens. Naumkeag operates year-round now. Though the house and gardens are accessible to visitors only seasonally from late spring through fall. The trustees employ full-time staff including Brian Cruey as portfolio director for Berkshire's properties and Mark Wilson as curator, plus seasonal workers who handle peak visitation periods. The operation is professional and complex. Managing a 48-acre historic property with 44 rooms, 12 gardens, and 70,000 annual visitors requires coordination. Maintenance budgets, insurance, marketing, and constant vigilance against entropy. The property was designated a National Historic Landmark District in 2007, having been listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1975. The designation recognizes both architectural and landscape significance. Stanford White's shingle-style house, represents late 19th century American domestic architecture at high quality. Fletcher Steele's gardens represent the evolution of 20th century landscape architecture from historicism through modernism. Together, they constitute an intact Gilded Age estate that survived when most comparable properties were demolished or subdivided. That survival was not accidental. It required Mabel's bequest, the trustees' stewardship, the anonymous donor's challenge grant, and millions of dollars in restoration investment. Programming has expanded far beyond what Mabel would recognize. Winterlights is an award-winning holiday illumination display that draws thousands of visitors during December. The Daffodil and Tulip Festival celebrates spring bulbs. The incredible Naumkeag Pumpkin Show features elaborate gourd displays each October. Yoga and meditation classes use the gardens as outdoor studios. Educational programs serve school groups and adults interested in architecture, horticulture, and history. The house offers standard docent-led tours plus specialized backstairs tours of servants' quarters that reveal how the estate functioned operationally during the Choate years. Accessibility remains limited. The property occupies a steep hillside. Steps connect garden levels. Paths are gravel or grass. The house contains stairways between floors. Installing elevators or ramps would compromise historic fabric and might be physically impossible given the topography. The trustees acknowledge the limitations in their promotional materials and work to accommodate visitors with mobility challenges where possible. But Naumkeag cannot be fully ADA compliant without fundamental alterations that would destroy what makes it significant. Rules reflect the property's dual nature as public attraction and fragile historic site. Dogs are prohibited to protect gardens and wildlife. Mountain biking is banned on the trails. Photography is permitted for personal use, but professional portrait sessions require advance permits and fees. The restrictions are standard for historic properties that must balance access with preservation. Too much public use damages what people come to see. Finding equilibrium between welcoming visitors and protecting resources requires constant adjustment. Financial sustainability remains challenging despite restoration success. The endowment has grown from Mabel's original $900,000 in 1958 to approximately $3 million in 2025. That represents growth. But inflation means the real value has increased only modestly. The 4% draw rule provides roughly $120,000 annually for operations. Admission revenue contributes another third of the operating budget. Trustees' membership dues and special event income provide the remainder. Annual operating costs likely exceed $400,000 when staff salaries, utilities, insurance, maintenance, and programming are totaled. The margin is thin. Major repairs or unexpected problems require special fundraising campaigns. Climate change presents new challenges. Winters are less predictable. Ice storms damage trees. Unusually warm periods cause plants to break dormancy early. Then subsequent freezes kill new growth. Summer droughts stress vegetation. Heavy rainstorms cause erosion on the steep hillside. The water system Steele designed assumes certain precipitation patterns. Those patterns are changing. Adaptation requires ongoing investment and experimentation with hardier plant varieties. Infrastructure continues aging. The house needs roof repairs, window restoration, and mechanical system updates. Energy efficiency improvements could reduce utility costs but require upfront capital. The greenhouses need climate control systems that are more reliable and less expensive to operate. Every year brings new requirements that compete for limited funds. Preservation is never finished. It is a commitment to perpetual care funded by perpetually insufficient resources. The irony is obvious. Mabel spent 70 years at Naumkeag expanding gardens that created increasing isolation and beauty. She retreated from society into rooms of her own making. She never married after her breakdown in 1900. She watched her siblings die or break. She inherited grief and built paradise. Then she gave it all to strangers. The fortress she created became the attraction she avoided. 70,000 people annually walk paths she walked alone. They photograph steps she descended in solitude. They tour rooms where she lived privately. What was built as withdrawal now welcomes the world. That transformation was her intention. The bequest to the trustees was deliberate. She could have kept Naumkeag private or left it to family. She chose public access instead. Whether that decision represented generosity, restitution, or simply recognition that beauty should be shared is unknowable. The result is that one woman's 70-year retreat became America's premier example of early 20th century landscape architecture available for public experience. Thousands benefit from her isolation. The partnership between Mabel and Fletcher Steele produced something neither could have created independently. She provided money, time, and sophisticated aesthetic judgment. He provided genius, training, and design vision. Both were people who could not have conventional lives. She never married after her breakdown. He was probably homosexual. Together they built something that survives them and justifies the investments required to maintain it. Of 700 Fletcher Steele gardens, only 2 survive. Naumkeag is the only one the public can visit. That was Mabel's gift. The house and gardens require constant work. The trustees continue. Visitors continue. The story continues. Buildings survive when people decide they matter. That decision requires money, vision, and sustained commitment across generations. Most Gilded Age estates failed that test. They were demolished when heirs could not afford maintenance, subdivided when land became more valuable than architecture, or simply abandoned to decay when no one cared enough to prevent it. Naumkeag survived because one woman decided it should, structured her bequest carefully, and provided resources to make survival possible. Then others, the trustees, donors, staff, visitors, agreed with her decision and contributed what was needed to honor it. What Naumkeag represents is complicated. It is a monument to immense wealth accumulated through legal practice and fortunate timing. Joseph Hodges Choate earned substantial fees arguing cases for wealthy clients. He invested wisely. He bought land and built a summer house. That was standard Gilded Age behavior. What makes Naumkeag different is what happened afterward. The house that was supposed to provide escape became a place where tragedy concentrated. 3 of 5 children died or broke. The family contracted. The survivors continued. Joseph built the house seeking summer refuge. He found beauty and grief in approximately equal measure. Caroline maintained the estate through decades of loss, supporting women's education while managing a household that held too many empty rooms. Mabel inherited everything: the house, the grief, the money, the isolation. She spent 29 years after inheriting expanding gardens around a house that never changed. Each garden was another room, another layer of beautiful isolation. She was building something, though what exactly remained unclear until she died and bequeathed it all to strangers. The irony is that what Mabel built as withdrawal became an attraction. The gardens she designed for solitary walks now host 70,000 visitors annually. The house where she lived privately welcomes tour groups. The blue steps she descended alone are photographed thousands of times each summer. Her retreat became public heritage. That transformation was her choice. She could have kept it private. She chose otherwise. 2 people unable to have conventional lives, a reclusive heiress who never married after a nervous breakdown, and a probably homosexual landscape architect who also never married, spent 3 decades collaborating to create one of America's most significant 20th century landscapes. They understood each other. They shared aesthetic sensibilities. They had time and money. They built beauty together because they could not build conventional families. What they created outlasted them and justified the enormous investments required to preserve it. Fletcher Steele designed approximately 700 gardens during his career. Only 2 survive. Naumkeag is the only one open to the public. That makes it irreplaceable. Every dollar spent on restoration, every tree planted, every stone repointed, every fountain repaired, preserves not just one estate, but the only publicly accessible example of an important American artist's work. The stakes are higher than they initially appear. Buildings don't last 140 years by accident. They last because someone decides they should, provides resources to make that possible, and accepts that the work never ends. Naumkeag lasted because Mabel decided it should. Whether the decision came from generosity, guilt, loneliness, or simply aesthetic conviction is unknowable. The result is that a place built for private grief serves public education and enjoyment. The house stands at 5 Prospect Hill Road in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The trustees of Reservations own and operate it. It is open seasonally with hours varying by month. Admission fees apply. The property is not fully accessible due to steep terrain and historic limitations. Tours are available. The gardens are extraordinary. The story is darker than it appears from the parking lot. The story isn't finished. Maintenance continues. Gardens age, systems fail, visitors come, repairs happen, money gets raised. The blue steps need repainting every few years. Birch trees die and require replacement. Storms damage infrastructure. Climate change imposes new stresses. Every generation of stewards must decide whether Naumkeag matters enough to justify the ongoing costs. So far, the answer has been yes. That answer is never permanent. It must be renewed constantly through work, funding, and commitment. The fortress remains open because people keep it open. When that effort stops, the fortress closes.